So when you look at clerical diaries about these types of exorcisms, there are several Belgian priests who complain about being plagued at night by Satan, who has momentarily left the body of the possessed to come scare them away from the situation. Um, that kind of thing happens less with other demons. So I think the presence of Satan in that regard is also that it tends to become a high profile case more quickly.
Welcome to Witch Hunt Podcast, where we discuss the history of witchcraft, magic, and the supernatural. I'm Josh Hutchinson.
And I'm Sarah Jack. Today, we have an important discussion with author and historian Kristof Smeyers, who is joining us from Belgium.
Kristof specializes in the history of science, religion, and magic in the 19th and 20th centuries, with a focus on knowledge production about the occult and the supernatural.
He presented his specialized research on stigmata and exorcisms at the 2024 Magic and Witchcraft Conference in York, which Josh and I attended. His historical analysis provides important context and insight that you get to experience today.
So let's welcome Kristof Smeyers to the podcast.
Welcome to Witch Hunt Podcast. We were so happy to meet you at the Magic and Witchcraft Conference in York. Can you introduce yourself and share about your expertise and your recent research and writing?
Hi, and well, thanks for the invitation as well. I'm Kristof Smeyers. I'm a historian in Belgium, and I work primarily on the history of science, religion, and magic in the 19th and the 20th centuries.
What should we know about Belgium?
The question I tend to ask is, what do people actually know about Belgium, which is a tricky one sometimes. Well, the capital is Brussels, which is the center of all of the institutional side of the European Union, I suppose. It's also our capital. It's a tiny country, somewhere between France and Germany, with a very rich history in, especially when it comes to the history of witchcraft.
I'm really excited to talk to you about your expertise today because your work is in a later century than a lot of what we've talked about. So I'm expecting to learn a lot. I thought maybe we would start by learning about stigmata and its complexities.
Sure. So a couple of years ago, I started doing my PhD on the recent history of stigmata, so the wounds of Christ on people's mortal living bodies in Britain and Ireland. And it was part of a bigger project that looked at stigmata across Europe in the 19th and the 20th centuries. And that project was international, but it had a very strong emphasis on Catholic countries or countries that were predominantly Catholic, like Italy, Spain, also Belgium is a very Catholic country. And I thought maybe it's more interesting to go look for it in places that you wouldn't expect a phenomenon like that to appear so often. I looked at Britain, and in a second instance, also at Ireland, places with a very complicated religious landscape, very multifaceted, a lot of different smaller Christian groups vying for believers, for devotees, especially in the 19th and the 20th centuries. And it turned out that stigmata appeared not just among English Catholics or Irish Catholics. It wasn't a typically Irish Catholic phenomenon, for example, but so-called rational Anglicans were also experiencing profoundly bedazzling physical phenomena on their own bodies, and they didn't always know what to do with it or what it meant. And that in itself was interesting enough to write a whole book about. And also because it says so much about how religion was experienced in that period among so many different people in different ways.
I know your work is in more recent centuries, 19th and 20th centuries, but how old is the phenomenon of stigmata? Has it been around since well before that time period, or is it pretty new?
Well, the first one was Christ himself, I suppose, when he was crucified. But the first person we tend to call a stigmatic is Saint Francis of Assisi in the 13th century, who climbs a mountain and is visited by an angel who, he says in a vision, shoots angelic rays at his body that hit him in the palms of his hands and his feet. It's his side. So he gets the 5 wounds of Christ, and he goes through Christ's suffering with Christ. And that becomes he sets the template, I suppose, for the centuries after. But Predominantly, when you look at histories of these types of things, we think of it as a medieval phenomenon, something that was a phenomenon that was typical of a very bodily or embodied sense of religion that dies out as people become, that's the dominant narrative. As people become more rational and more scientific in their thinking, these types of things disappear. And that doesn't turn out to be the case at all. So the 19th and 20th centuries, and arguably still nowadays, are really the golden era of a phenomenon like stigmata. You also see it in the way that people talk about it in the 19th century, mostly skeptics and critics, by linking phenomena like that to early modern witchcraft, for example. They're just saying it's the next demonic thing in a different guise, or it's another manifestation of superstition and credulity, just like in the early modern period.
And you mentioned his suffering with Christ. Does it always go hand in hand with suffering?
Among
Or,
Catholics, definitely.
or
What I found in Britain, especially among non-Catholics, is that there could be a variety of different things. In the 1830s, there was a prophet in Canterbury, so in the south east of England, who claimed he was Christ reborn. And he had a big beard and he dressed in velvet and satin, but he also had the wounds of Christ. And he didn't seem to suffer much. He wrote a lot about what he went through and how he was going to organize Judgment Day, I suppose. But he wasn't bedbound like so many stigmatics were. He actually he claimed to be super strong. So he carried, while his hands were bleeding with the wounds of Christ, he lifted a barrel of beer above his head as a feat of strength, of supernatural strength. So that's an outlier statistically for
right.
how people with stigmata tended to behave. And you find them more in Britain than elsewhere, I think.
Oh, really? Are there like certain time periods when stigmata is more common? Are there certain situations that might happen societally or anything that influence the appearance of stigmatas?
It's a very difficult question to answer because you can see it appear more, or it becomes more visible in certain time periods, but it's difficult to say what is correlation and causation in that regard. You know that at some points in the 19th century, the Catholic Church feels it's in the defense, or it's being attacked by rationalists, later by Darwin, by science. And it feels the need to profile itself in a different way. And then you sometimes see a manifestation of people with stigmata more visibly than before. It's difficult to say that link is so clear cut to me, but it is there in some way.
You mentioned about how modern writing reveals this perspective of its ancientness, just like how some perceive magic's life too. And we know from all the interviewing we've done and reading and talking that right now, witch hunts are very active because of lots of beliefs and fear of evil magic. And so it's also an era where, hey, it's actually very alive in people's minds and affecting their behaviors. And um, media has played a lot of role in that, and academics writing and everybody writing. But how much of a role have news reports played in developing the popular belief about stigmata, including that it's not necessarily something happening now?
Huge, I think, is the very short answer to that. And that's part of the reason why we looked at the 19th and the 20th centuries to begin with. It's the period when the press becomes popular, becomes cheap, when you have the development of the yellow press, as they call it. So cheap pamphlets as well. Print becomes just terribly cheap. Everyone is suddenly writing as well and publishing things. So you get a lot of short pamphlets being published and they circulate all over the place. And whether they are defending the phenomenon or trying to ridicule it or trying to tell their readers that it's a really stupid thing to believe in, or a typically Catholic thing or a typically Italian thing, people still read it and still learn about it in some ways. Even if you write about a thing to discredit it, it still sparks a fire sometimes among its readership. And there are cases in Britain especially where just reading about a case on the continent for long enough, if the reporting about it goes on for a couple of weeks or a couple of months and it's detailed enough, there have been instances where that sparks actually a case of stigmatization in England or in Ireland. So the press has a very direct role in that in some way, as it continues to be in cases of magical beliefs and magical practices, I think.
What gender dynamics do you see in stigmata appearances?
Europe-wide, I would say, I think it's about 95% women. It would be interesting as well to analyze it more statistically and figure out what the age group would be, because very often we're talking about young women. And there's a significant number of women who experience the stigmata when they go into puberty, or for example, for reasons that are related to hormonal balances and blood as a symbol, etc. And we can talk about that more if you like, but it's also a significant portion of women who first become stigmatized at the age of 33. So when Christ is crucified,
Oh,
because that's the moment when they feel closest to him. But there's definitely a very large majority of women having stigmata.
That early age, is there any, correlation to Jesus's mother's age?
Not that I've found it, no. Surprisingly, no. There's also it's also a case of sometimes someone experiences the stigmata once, sometimes it stays with them for the rest of their lives and they experience it every week or at least every year during Easter. So it affects people's lives in different ways, depending on the person almost. It depends on the context. Sometimes it happens in social isolation. Sometimes it happens inside a convent. In some cases, it's a little bit clearer from the sources that there has been involvement from a priest, sometimes some coaxing, some encouragement, sometimes some forced stigmatization. So those contexts are different from person to person.
is there any particular case you'd be interested in telling us about?
One of the cases I've looked at the closest, where the source material has been very rich for me, was an English prophetess from the 1860s to the 1880s called Mary Ann Girling, who has been active mostly in London itself, but also on the Isle of Wight, which is that little island in Hampshire, so the south of England. And she's also been in the New Forest in Hampshire, which is a place with a very long history of magic and also witchcraft. And there are covens there today. And it's still a place where it hangs heavy in the air, you could say. And it's interesting that she chose that place to become stigmatized, to me.
Yes.
It's also a place where she chose to build up a cult following, you could say, also to wait for Judgment Day, which was going to strike in New Forest in, I think, 1882, 1883. And it's an interesting case also because the way she uses not just her own body, or she instrumentalizes what she experiences. It becomes the center, her body becomes the center of this cult. It also becomes the main thing to convince new followers with. But she also uses the media in an interesting way, going back to what we were just talking about. So the press is very interested in her, but she curates the image that she can present in the press by allowing some journalists close to her and keeping some at a distance. She also writes in the newspapers herself. So there's an interesting dynamic there of how you profile yourself as a public mystic or a public prophetess.
Yeah, one of the interviews of yours that I found on YouTube, you said something about some people are able to harness what is being used against them. So that's an example of that.
Yeah, it's true. I'd forgotten I said that, but yeah.
Are all stigmatics, do they all have mystical abilities, or is that just some of them?
But the ones that we know most about, the stigmata, tend to be the final stage in an escalating series of mystical phenomena. Very often, and I don't want to generalize this, but very often it starts out with maybe not diabolic possession, but diabolic, how shall I say it? Turbulence, maybe is the right word. People being harassed basically by demonic forces. And that increases from there to very often all types of illness. There's definitely a correlation between being stigmatized and having a history of illness.
Mhm.
But also there are often, a lot of them have clairvoyance, have had visions, go through religious ecstasies regularly. And then in the end are rewarded in a way by being closest to Christ, by sharing his bodily suffering. It's in a way the most intimate mystical phenomena you can experience if you're looking for that type of relationship with Christ.
Yeah, it just reminded me of something. Samuel Paris, who was the minister of Salem Village when the Salem witch trials broke out, used to preach a lot about we are to be broken and bruised like the body of Christ. I can see where that you take that kind of teaching and absorb that, and then this expresses itself this way.
Exactly. Yeah. I hadn't thought of that. But yeah.
Mhm.
That language is also very present in the way religion is still circulating in the 19th century. Language of the bruised body and the, the redemptive power of suffering.
Yeah. The crucifixion, of course, was a spiritual healing. And you said the tie to sickness, and it's the spiritual experience. Is healing seen after or through the stigmata as well? Bodily healing?
Yeah, in some cases that happens, yes. Or there will be a miraculous healing immediately followed by stigmatization. Usually it will be an illness that is so severe that doctors have said that it is a hopeless case or that death will be imminent, at which point the supernatural healing or the miraculous healing tends to happen in these narratives. And it is followed by a blessing that manifests on the body. Yeah. So you've gone through all this bodily suffering and all this mental suffering, this earthly suffering, and you've passed through that. And as a reward, you get to suffer with Christ.
Thank you so much for jumping in. I know there is a lot of complexity to this. And just like we've learned with history on witch hunts, each story and each person is unique and has these different intersections. But thank you for going into that with us. We really enjoyed your presentation at the conference where you spoke on right and wrong, RITE and wrong, lay exorcists in Belgium, 1800 to 1850.
I'd like to just establish what is an exorcism and what is not an exorcism.
This is in a way the central question of my research into exorcism, because there is a very easy answer, and that's given by the church, which is it is a rite of cleansing a demonic presence that has taken hold of someone's body. And you do it through a very specific rite that is prescribed, and it is quite administrative in some aspects. It's not at all the spectacular scenes that might pop into your head when you think of the word exorcism. But when you look at possession or demonic possession in practice, exorcism can mean a lot more than just that. Also, because when you shift your focus from the prescribed rite to how people felt and what people felt they needed to be helped, that rite doesn't really cover it, or it doesn't really respond to people's needs as often as they would like. So there's a whole range of practices that are called exorcisms, also in the 19th and the 20th centuries, which are provided by priests, but also by a bunch of lay healers, by cunning folk, by people who are unwitches. There's a whole marketplace, you could say, of magical service providers, also in Belgium, where I've been looking at most closely, who all provide exorcisms. And that can take all kinds of shapes. And it also really depends on, the customer, in a way, to call them that, about the specific needs and the specific description of their possession. So there are cunning folk who use magical charms. There are also priests who use magical charms. So it's not just the boundary between the rite of exorcism and the exorcism in practice. It's also about how the boundary between religion and magic continues to be very, very porous well into the 20th century.
That was so great. I just want to real quick, when you talked about the needs being met versus the right and how it goes through the cleansing, there really is that gap that we see people hitting, because here in the US, when we're finding children that have died through exorcisms, it has been often family who was trying to find a way to get rid of evil or help the child, or both. Not necessarily both, but I really see how that could play out into these unfortunate circumstances when you have that need, but then there's the official work that should be taking care of the spirit.
You mentioned this porous boundary between religion and magic. Could you explain that a little more?
Yeah, sure. Just to stick with exorcism, I think what struck me, what I found more surprising than the lay exorcists or lay healers or cunning folk using religious imagery or using the rite of exorcism itself or using saints or the invocation of saints to perform an exorcism was the readiness with which priests and clergy were using alternative means or integrating alternative aspects of all kinds of belief systems and beliefs in their exorcism practice. So the ease with which, for example, in 1853 or 1854, I think a priest in this is County Limerick now, so we're in Ireland. I've also looked at Ireland. Um, invokes not just the Virgin Mary when he's exorcising someone, but also the Queen of Fairies, and actually needs both of these figures to help him exorcise the demon, are things that surprised me initially a lot more. Also, in a way, the willingness of the church as an institution to look the other way when knowing that these things were happening, because they recognized that this was a response to a particular need. Magic was allowed within the Catholic Church to an extent, you could say, and that's maybe a bit of a strong statement, but it does show how magic or magical practice or other types of unorthodox beliefs kept entering Catholic practice well into the 20th century. So I find cases of this well into the 1950s, 1960s here in Belgium, which is, again, is a very Catholic country. The church is a very present institution, very present cultural institution in this country well into the 1960s. And yet parish priests everywhere across the country are deploying magical practices to exorcise demons. And that is not considered a problem by most people.
Do they recognize it as magical practice? Here in the United States, I've come to understand magic and all the things that we do that are magical, or little exorcisms, cleansing. Why do you think it's not being recognized as part of our behaviors? Why do you think that is?
I think it's implicitly recognized by a lot of people. I don't want to point the finger at the 19th century again, but it is a bit of a cliche for historians to say everything bad stems from the 19th century. But there is a type of social taboo that was cast on certain things
Yeah.
relating to magic or magical practice or to certain types of beliefs. It's the period in which the term superstition became a nomen for pretty much anything that someone disapproved of. And partly because of the way the press dealt with it, but also because of the way people, and I think this is a hypothesis, but the way people attempted to position themselves within a time period that is considered itself to be modern, and therefore non-magical, placed all those things in a taboo sphere where it was done, but kept quiet. There is the book by, I think I have it here somewhere, by the ethnologist Jeanette Favre-Sada, who did field work in France in the 50s. And her respondents, so all the people she talked to, one of the most common phrases there was that it's just something that is done without talking about it. We don't need to talk about it. In fact, talking about it can disenchant something, but it can also make certain types of
Yeah.
dark magic stronger. So there's a double taboo almost.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's still the case at the moment. Maybe less so than it was 20 years ago. I do feel like when I ask my students this, there's an openness to talk about what they practice, um, about what they believe as well, which continues to surprise me.
Yeah. I think I've noticed when I'm interacting with people now, if I recognize a ritual that they are embracing or doing or talking about, I will recognize that. Oh, tell me more about this ritual. And sometimes I'll get the look like, oh, it's a ritual. Like that's not necessarily normally spoken, but I enjoy recognizing them now. So the devil, I wanted to bring him in a little bit. If you could talk about him in exorcisms.
Basically, what is the devil's role in possessions and exorcisms?
Again, that varies from case to case. Sometimes it's the devil, it's Satan himself who possesses a person. Sometimes, and most times, it's one of his, or one or several of the demons in his legions of hell. There have been what I see a lot in the 19th century here in Belgium is that when the devil himself is said to be inside a body, the exorcism tends to escalate. So it becomes harder. Very often it requires multiple priests. Sometimes help is called upon from outside Belgium. There was in the 1830s, 1840s, there was a very well-known exorcist from Luxembourg, which is a neighboring country, who was a bishop there, who had a very good reputation of doing very difficult exorcisms. So he came to Belgium a couple of times to deal with the devil himself. In practice, it was also clear that not everyone doing an exorcism should attempt to talk to the devil if he was inside, because he's the father of lies. There is no point to it anyway. Any information you'll get from him will be a lie. But more dangerously, trying to talk to the devil might incite the devil to leave that person's body and try and take possession of a priest. So when you look at clerical diaries about these types of exorcisms, there are several Belgian priests who complain about being plagued at night by Satan, who has momentarily left the body of the possessed to come scare them away from the situation. That kind of thing happens less with other demons. So I think the presence of Satan in that regard is also that it tends to become a high profile case more quickly.
Yeah. What other kinds of things have been recorded about their experiences? The exorcism is interesting, but to hear what they have felt or experienced individually because of their involvement, that's fascinating.
So most of those sources we have about how it felt are from priests who mostly describe what they feel, which is interesting as well. But we very rarely get insight into what it actually feels like for the person who is possessed, who
Yeah.
claims to be possessed, who is suffering from demonic enterprises. I have looked at a rare type of source, as far as I can tell, which is I can only call it an exorcism diary, which was held and kept by the nuns of a monastery nearby where I live in a small town in the 1890s. They had an inmate, I suppose you could call it, because she was not allowed to leave. A young woman, again, who was allegedly possessed by 7 demons and was put through daily exorcisms basically for about 7 years in this monastery. And the diary runs for about 7 years. So you see the handwriting change as different nuns take over. And that's extremely detailed. And they allegedly, because you can't ever be sure, write down verbatim the conversations they have with the person who is possessed and with the demons as well. And from those conversations emerges an experience of deep, deep suffering, I would say, of an immense pain, physically and mentally, not just because they're possessed, because of the daily exorcisms they're put through.
Oh,
And
yeah.
you can imagine if you start out with the prescribed rite and it doesn't seem to have an effect, after 7 years, you're doing something quite different. Arguably, those nuns were torturing that woman without salvation, you could say. So for 7 years, she's basically been put through hell in a way.
Yeah.
And it's hard to read, but it's also hard to read because these nuns are describing what the woman is saying. The woman is telling them how hard it is and how much she wished them to stop doing it. And they just write it down and continue for years. I've not come across sources like that anywhere else.
Yeah. It's a real example of this humanity is lost, like the sight, they've lost sights that she's a woman like them. And we see that every day. Yeah. Mhm.
You suspect it in a lot of these cases, but you don't see it as explicitly as I saw it in that diary. Um, Also because then the link with witchcraft is made very quickly. Um, Exorcism and witchcraft have very close ties anyway, you could say. But the way she is being interrogated in a way by the nuns, it resembles the early modern witch persecutions in some ways. Verity, but also the torture that goes with it.
Yeah, Rebecca Greensmith of Connecticut just came to mind right away because it was a minister who interrogated her in the jail. And she was in misery in what we know because it's
Yeah.
his.
Yeah.
What was written was that by the end of the questioning, she was ready to tear herself in two, or some expression like that, that she was ready to go to extreme lengths to end just the questioning. And we don't think that they used any judicial torture in Connecticut or anything like that. So just being berated, I guess.
Yeah.
It's a dehumanizing process very often. But I have also found sources that are the opposite in a way, where the exorcism is described also not just by the priest, but also by the person going through it and by family members as a process of healing,
Mm.
physically and spiritually, without the types of torment we've just talked about,
Yeah.
where it's sometimes just a matter of praying very hard together and the demon is seen fleeing the body. And then the church bells ring and they leave the church and the whole village is gathered there and everyone is happy. So it's the other extreme almost.
Is there still public celebrations of successful exorcisms?
Not that I know of, no. Belgium is going through a bit, or well, Europe is going through a bit of an exorcism boom, you could say, past 20 years within its Catholic communities. And to the point where the Vatican has now these summer courses, you could say, for priests who can, it's a type of crash course into exorcism so that they can respond to the increasing demand in their parish. But it seems like it has, when we talk about the rite as it's prescribed, that seems to be overwhelmingly the way it's done within Catholic communities. It contrasts quite starkly with what you can call DIY exorcisms, like the ones you hinted at earlier, when family members take things into their own hands and it gets out of hand, with fatal conclusions sometimes.
Yeah. Well, we have seen cases in the past. I know of, is it Annalise Michel, who passed away, unfortunately, during an exorcism that went too far. Have you seen other cases in the 19th or 20th century that would be along those lines? It was like they were going through the ritual and it wasn't working and maybe things escalated.
She's definitely the most well-known case in Europe, and she actually sparked in the 1970s a wave of exorcisms in Belgium as well and possession cases. But despite the the horrible conclusion of the whole story, it still caused, well, a wave of possession cases, interestingly. I can't think of any that had a similarly dramatic conclusion, at least in that period elsewhere, or not within Catholicism, at least. There have been several cases here in Belgium in Muslim communities where young girls have died in very similar situations, like Anneliese Michel in the 1970s. Often in situations where there was no clergy around, but people took matters into their own hands.
In the 17th century, possessions would get blamed on witchcraft, like a witch is causing this. Do we still see that today as bewitchment as a cause of possession?
In Catholic Europe, I don't see it anymore. No, interesting. But it's not, I would also say, I still see it in the 19th century. There's a town near Antwerp, which is one of the biggest cities here in Belgium, that in the 1830s had flurry of witchcraft and possession cases where a band of witches, as they called it, a new band of witches, I think it was, caused a mass possession, basically, and therefore also required a mass exorcism
Wow.
of priests. And there the link was very explicit. Yeah. It was the witches doing it. And then in court, they also testified to say that Satan had made them do it.
And this was in the
That,
1800s.
that's 1833,
Oh,
1834.
wow.
With the difference that those accused of witchcraft were then not executed. They were, I think, they were imprisoned because of causing civil unrest.
Oh,
Um, but then so were the other people who called for the exorcism. So they were put in prison together. So there is a shift there, I think, a very slow
Mm,
shift in the way things like this is dealt with.
yeah. So these summer sessions of preparing priests for exorcisms, because there's more of a need, that's gonna are we gonna learn more? Is the general public gonna be we're confronted with exorcism in Hollywood and book and fiction all the time, but are these stories, these exorcism stories gonna be more around us, or will it be kept behind the church walls? How does that work?
That's also a very good question. There is no real transparency about these things. The major exorcism hub, if you want to call it that, or a center of expertise here in Belgium is an abbey of Norbertines that allegedly do over 1,000 exorcisms a year. That's 3 a day.
That is
And they have no records about this. So the church as a whole tends not to keep records about exorcisms unless they go wrong. So it's very difficult to give any type of statistics about how often exorcism is actually performed. If I talk to parish priests, they will tell me. And I have no reason to assume that they're making up the numbers. But there is no official statistics, and there's also no official written record of what is done and how it's done. And in a way that's similar to what was going on in the 19th century. The church also didn't keep records or official records then either. The cases we hear the most about are the cases that have escalated, that have gone wrong or have gone very right. But your standard exorcism is almost invisible in historical sources
mm,
because it's just considered to be a rite. It's just part of the task set of a priest.
yeah.
So it touches on issues of privacy and, well, now GDPR.
and the parish priests weren't the only ones doing the exorcisms. You mentioned there were lay people doing exorcisms as well. How would those have been different from each other, the priest versus the lay person?
Lay exorcists seem to have had a lot more, shall I put it, room in which to improvise or to develop their own practices in a way that they seemed fit. Very often they provided exorcism as one in a toolbox of magical services or as one of many services they provided. So what you find a lot in the 19th century here in Belgium is magnetizers. So people who were mesmerists, I suppose, who used, shall I describe animal magnetism? It's the belief that the cosmos, or that there is a current, a current of energy that runs through the cosmos and runs through people itself as well. And if that gets blocked, you get ill. And mesmerists or magnetizers can heal that and restore the flow. So that was something that was popular in the 19th century. And that fitted very well with exorcism as a practice. So lay healers combined the two very often. So they would restore the current, often by taking the demon out of a body, for example. So you see how, especially in the lay practices, exorcism develops or changes depending on what was culturally available in a way.
Yeah.
When later spiritualism becomes more popular and more present, lay exorcists shift towards spiritualism as well, or towards hypnosis.
Yeah. Like there's a different toolbox available to you depending what time and place that you are. Yeah.
And also it depends on what people expect from you. There are many cases in which a priest has done the exorcism exactly as prescribed, and people say it's been completely ineffective because it doesn't look very spectacular. It doesn't look like there's anything going on. The priest hasn't exerted enough spiritual authority, I guess, to make it look like he did something. And
Yeah.
then a lay exorcist very often will lay it on thick.
So there's like this performative aspect then to exorcism. You have to put on a show or your customers won't believe that you're being effective.
Yeah, but that's also the case for priests. By the 19th century, there's a shift between the early modern period and the 19th, 20th century, where the priests who before then would perform an exorcism mostly as a channeling God's power. That changes at some point in the early 19th century towards priests saying it is basically their own spiritual authority causing the demon to run away. Not so much, God is still there, but they're not just channeling it. It depends on the persona of the priest. Yeah.
We really appreciate you doing this with us. I learned a lot. It's such an important topic. Even though there's so much that is variable and elusive, it is just such a really important thing to open our eyes and look at as much as possible. So thanks for your work. What do you have coming up next? Do you have any books or projects you want to talk?
I'm in the process of writing a book about exorcisms in Belgium, which I think I've promised the publisher it would be done this year. So it's now the 6th of January. Yeah. Setting myself this as a deadline. Um, and I've started doing research on, shall I put it, contemporary heritage related to the early modern witch hunts here in Belgium and the Netherlands. That's something that's started about 20 years ago, the erection of monuments and the apologies and the pardons and the citizen initiatives, I guess, or the restoration or the memorialization of some witches or some people accused of witchcraft and not others. So there's an interesting selection procedure going on there. And there's a lot of political momentum around it, which I'm starting to look into.
I am so excited about that. It's interesting to me because obviously of the work we do, but we I wonder how much you'll see initiatives passing with a generation that passes, because we've seen some of that here in the 1930s with Goody Cole, New Hampshire. A lot was done and there was a big focus. There was historical anniversaries happening. And then jumping over to Boston, Goody Glover, she does have a plaque, but there were priests who were working on getting a monument for her, and that never was completed. But we're working in Massachusetts to get acknowledgement for those that are known to have gone through witch trials. So that some of those things have come up. So I will really enjoy learning about your research on that. It's
I'll
detailed than
probably
that,
have
I know,
to,
but
I'll probably depend on your expertise at some point in the near future about this. Yes.
Oh, great.
So I might be in touch sooner rather than later.
great. That'd be great. But yeah, people wonder how many episodes can we come up with? There's thousands because we haven't even really got to jump into these modern or any time that there's been a, an effort to recognize somebody who has gone through this in a memorial. We have hardly touched on that. And globally, there's been a lot. There has
Yeah.
been a lot, especially in local communities. But I would love to learn about who's been acknowledged and who hasn't and why.
Yeah. I mean, I can't talk much about it yet
I
because I don't know
know.
much about it yet, but it's tempting to anyway.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, but we've seen that selective nature of who gets a monument, who gets exonerated. Over time, there have been different efforts in Massachusetts, in particular, to add more people to it, but still people get excluded every time. So we're trying to come in and say, everybody
Yeah.
who had this happen to them is, we're clearing their name and we're going to remember them and what their what they went through, how that's still relevant for us now.
Yeah, and I'll be curious too, like, if when you're looking, um, if you see that more, marginalized individuals are left out, because there's a little girl from the Salem, um, history, 4 years old or so, she is not recognized on a memorial. Prison for months, but she's never been and her situation she wasn't hung, her mother was, but she was interrogated and indicted and all that, and no recognition for her, and I think
They
that's
made
very
little
sad.
shackles for her. They specially made little things to fit around her ankles and wrists so that she'd be bound. So,
Yeah,
yeah,
They're difficult histories.
yeah.
yeah,
Well,
yeah. Well, thank you so very much. This has been delightful. And now Sarah has In Witch Hunts news.
as the executive director of End Witch Hunts, I want to emphasize the critical importance of demonstrating the connection of historical injustices with ongoing persecution of innocent people around the world through drawing recognizable parallels between the accusations and persecution faced by victims of historical witch trials and those suffering from similar accusations today. Do you understand the enduring nature of persecution? Historical injustices mirror ongoing persecution worldwide. Our mission to end witch hunts connects centuries old victims to those suffering from accusations today. By breaking the silence around these cases, we forge a path toward justice for all victims, past and present. Connecticut's 2023 resolution, HJ34, a resolution concerning certain witchcraft convictions in colonial Connecticut, stands as a landmark success in colonial witch trial exonerations. This achievement proves that community advocacy and collaboration can bring justice, providing a model for current legislative efforts. Connecticut's public testimony records offer invaluable guidance for effective advocacy in other states. Right now, two critical initiatives need your support. Massachusetts HD 3054 seeks justice for 8 pre Salem victims in Boston, while Maryland's HJ2 addresses colonial era witch trial convictions too. Many colonial witch trial victims remain without recognition, as witch hunts extended far beyond Salem, affecting innocent men, women, and children across multiple colonies. Take action now. Prepare written testimony for legislative committees in both Massachusetts and Maryland. Prepare to speak at upcoming hearings in both Massachusetts and Maryland. Visit endwitchhunts.org for guidance. Massachusetts residents, contact your legislative representative and ask them to co-sponsor the HD 3054 bill. Maryland residents, contact your legislative representative and ask them to co-sponsor HJ2. Reference Connecticut's HJ34 testimonies for effective advocacy examples. Your action is crucial. Whether you're a descendant or a concerned citizen, join us in securing justice for these historical victims.
Thank you, Sarah.
You're welcome. Mary Bingham returns with a new Minute with Mary.
One way to educate the public regarding current spiritual and ritual abuse cases is to compare them to colonial witch trial cases. Since most will read articles on stories of the Salem witch trials, I decided to propose a story to the uncommon ground that will compare the tragedy of 4-year-old Dorothy Good, accused of bewitching her neighbors over 333 years ago, and the sad existence she lived after she was released from jail, to the accusation of demonic possession against 3-year-old Ariely Proctor only 4 years ago that resulted in her death. Though masked a little differently, the parallels of these two cases, almost 330 years apart, offer stunning similarities. Stay tuned for the soon-to-be published article.
Thank you, Mary.
And thank you for joining us today on this podcast.
You should check out our robust catalog of expert discussions.
Have a great today and a beautiful tomorrow.